Hello, everyone. My name is Roger Walburn. I'm the General Manager of Hot Rolled and Specialty Products for NLMK USA. I also have the distinct honor and privilege of working with the Steel Market Update team on their Steel 101 classes that are held at various locations throughout the United States. And for the last couple of years, I've been a part of the team that's presented course content ranging for the whole steel industry from beginning to end, and really taking the products of a steel mill on into the marketplace. So we cover a lot of content, and we're attempting now to be a little bit more virtual these days of the pandemic, and hope to share with you a sneak peek, what I'm calling an introductory sneak peek of the Steel 101 products that we hope to take to market on the internet for on-demand modules, but hopefully again soon, very soon, live in-person classes. One of the unique things about the Steel 101 class is that the Steel Market Update team has partnered with steel mills around the country and partnered with the class with a mill tour and an opportunity to see steel making firsthand, which is a great experience, especially from my perspective being a steel mill guy. I love the fact that we get to do that, and NLMK has the distinct privilege of being an honor really of being the first mill to have hosted one of these classes with a tour. And we will also have the distinct note of being the first one to have been canceled in the pandemic. So we're looking forward to getting our products and information out to market again as the market hopefully recovers very soon. And again, like I say, in live in-person classes. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of what the Steel 101 class is and what it might do for you in terms of coming, sending yourself or your colleagues, anybody in your industry. And I just wanted to touch on some of the things we cover. Actually, I have a few slides here I'll share with you if I can. I want to give you an overview of what the course is all about. We want to go into an example of the course content and just give you a quick snippet of the kinds of things that we cover. One of the things I wanted to focus in on, one of the things I find most interesting is that people can be in the industry for years and not understand the distinct differences between what some people call grades versus designations versus specifications. And then I want to take that into what that means for steel properties and performance, and really make a relatable steel processing example even here during the class, during this video, that you might find interesting and hopefully memorable, something you might want to share with your colleagues. Well, again, speaking of the course in general, it's been interesting to see the wide breadth and depth of the folks that come. We have CEOs, business owners that come. We have people from the financial side of things. We have new hires into the steel industry, brand new out of college. We have folks that maybe are transplants, folks that might have come from aluminum and want to understand more about steel, how it's made, how it's marketed, how it's sold, all of those things. So a brief overview of the course is, we talk about the industry structure, how it's organized in the world, but particularly in the United States, the difference between the integrated steel makers and the differences between the electric arc furnace steel makers, or the mini mills sometimes referred to. We go through the processing of all of those mills, what is unique about each one and what's common to each one. We talk about the different product forms that are made, the flat rolled, the plate, the hot rolled coils, the cold rolled coils, galvanized, painted. We talk about automotive steels. We cover long products, the end use and applications, all the specifications. And really from the mill's perspective, what they're most interested in taking to market. But then also part of the team I get to work with does a great job of expanding that and taking that to market. And we talk about how commodity prices impact steelmaking prices and costs, and how those all are interrelated, and how the whole supply chain works. The role of the mills versus the service centers versus the distributors, and on into the marketplace, and for where everything ultimately goes. Excuse me. We have an interactive program where we go through pricing modules to give you a sense of how the actual processing or purchasing side of things is done. We go through examples to talk about this product, how it might be bought and sold, and what key parameters are important to be worried about from the purchasing side of things and also the supply side of things, and really marrying those two things up. We also talk about indexing from the standpoint that the CRU is well known for providing index information to the whole marketplace, so that there's a third-party verifiable information out there that says these are what the spot prices are, and to help people know how to index or how to build monthly contracts, that kind of thing, and really how it's all interrelated. Has been a genuine pleasure of mine to see and learn from my colleagues who are helping to present this content, but also from the folks who come to the class and share from their world and their experience things that are useful to them, and that helps really everybody in the meeting gain a lot. And I've enjoyed getting to do that and to understand more about what folks are dealing with and how they go about their world. So again, a little bit into that, that's the overview of the course, but I also wanted to give you an example of the course content, just to get you a sense of what the class is like. And one of the key things that we kind of hammer home about why steel is so unique and why it's used in the varying product forms that it is throughout the country, throughout the world, really is quite the unique material. And it's also an interesting challenge because I know the financial side of things, the commercial side of things, often folks think of it as a commodity. You know, they think of it as a one-trick pony that is this one thing that does so many things. But really, to the point I want to bring home from the engineering and technical side of things is that it's a highly engineered product and it's not easily fungible or transferable from one truckload to another. Each truckload to a customer is going to be very specific, not only for gauge and width, but for things like how strong is it? What is the material characteristics? What's the strength level? What's the formability level? What's the finish? Does it have coating on it or not? And all to the number of extremes and the iterations that make each truckload very unique, to the point that the mills, our mills, each order we get is a custom designed order of a highly engineered product. But again, with broad, wide-ranging capabilities to meet all kinds of different applications. One of the ways that that shows up, and one of the experiences I've had having my background being metallurgy and material science, and now working on the commercial team with NLMK, is to see how people need to speak the same language. And that comes across, I think, in this great example here of grades versus designations versus specifications. People use different terms, and in their world, it means one thing. But really, as you consider how the different players in the marketplace interact with each other, it's important to consider these differences. One example is 1010 being a grade of steel. That just defines the basic chemistry. Then we have things like CS, often CS type B here in the States, where we call it commercial steel type B. That means something else. And in fact, it's a wider range than even grades are defined. And I have some examples here, versus things like A36, which is really just a specification, but has with it expectations on chemistry and performance. And a lot of those times, these terms are used interchangeably, and it's going to be important for anybody who's buying and selling steel to make sure that they speak the right language and get specific, because again, it's not that generic fungible commodity. It's a highly engineered product. If you come to the class, you're going to fully understand that, but I'm hoping through this little video, you'll get a quick snippet of what that really all means. One of the things I wanted to highlight, just again briefly, not to go overboard with details, but to give you a sense of where this comes from, is if we look at my next slide, we see grades. These are a lot of the common grades from, in this case, ASTM A568. One of the specifications that are out there that will list these grade limits. And in fact, there's a whole bunch more, but this tends to be the higher volume ones, the ones, at least from my experience, my company often produces the most of. And you can see how carbon is defined with a range. So when we talk about 1010, for instance, you can see there in the middle of the table, its definitional range is 8.08 to 0.13 carbon. Carbon is the most important alloying content in steel, and that's going to be true on any product of any type. Carbon is why it's called carbon steel. It's a tiny fraction. In fact, if you look at this, 0.1 approximately weight percent in steel is less than 1 percentage point of the total amount of weight that we might ship someone. Most of it's iron, and there's other things like manganese that's listed here and other elements that come along for the ride. But carbon is so important that it defines even the grades that we use. And you can see that the grade name, like 1010, or in the case of 1021, those last two digits are in the approximate middle range of the definitional limit for 18 to 23. But the one thing that, if you come to the class, you'll get a full understanding of this, is that range is actually pretty large, all things considered. It's nice to think that if we make a piece of steel and we test it and it comes at, say, 0.08 weight percent carbon, we could call it a 1006 or a 1008 or a 1010. But really what these grades are kind of highlighting is the fact that with such a large range, there's the potential for some variability in what you might receive. And that may or may not be a problem for you depending upon your application. But knowledge is power. And we want you to have that information available to you so that you understand that when you say to a steel mill 1010, you're not getting necessarily 0.10 weight percent carbon. You can see a range, and that might affect properties. Properties of steel are defined not only by chemistry, which is all this is doing at this point, but it's also all the processing, the way that the atoms are arranged on a molecular level in the steel that's delivered, and also how it was processed, what temperatures were used, how much cold reduction was used, how much work was put into that steel, what finishes we ultimately provide. They're all a function that can affect the properties that are delivered to your door. And it just starts with chemistry. So it's important to know that as the background, as the fundamental level, that, you know, a 1010 steel could have a range of carbon that might ultimately affect properties, and it's important to note that. Now, if you go one step further and talk about these designations that are defined by ASTM, in this case, I pulled from ASTM A1008. That happens to be the specification that defines cold rolled products. There's also similar ones for hot rolled products, A1011. There's also ones for galvanized products, A653, for example. And these designations, as they've been defined, are sort of the way to speak in the industry, to help everybody speak the same language about the generic kinds of product classes that can be offered and bought and sold. And the most common one is CS, commercial steel. Type B is the most common one, and it's defined as 2 to 15 carbon. By definition, if I'm going to sell a piece of steel as a CS Type B, it needs to range from 0.2 to 1.5 carbon. And I hope you get from the class, you certainly will, but even from this little video, how wide of a range that really is. I mean, if you think about the minimum being 0.2 and the max being 7.5 times more, that there's the potential that you'd see the amount of carbon having a huge effect on properties, maybe potentially adding some product variability in what you might receive if you just told your supplier you wanted CS Type B. Now, with it comes some expectations on yield strength and elongation, and they're listed here even in the spec, but those aren't guaranteed. And the range that they might show up in a product that's delivered to your door is important to consider how it might affect you and your processing and ultimately what you want to deliver to your customer. There's other ranges here, you know, DS, Type B, drawing steel. You can see how it maxes out carbon at 0.08, DDDS at 0.06, and EDDS, extra deep drawing steel, at 0.02. So in fact, there's other levels that go along with that, more deep into the spec beyond the course, beyond the level of this little video I want to give you, but we'll talk about it in the course to the point you fully understand what all those different product categories mean. But one little example that might make sense to you here, when we talk about these ranges from 2 to 15 carbon, and if you added 7 times as much of an important ingredient, how big of an effect that could be. Imagine that you go to your local pub or your local bar, and your favorite bartender makes your favorite drink and you just love it and it's great. You order it the same every time. Well, if you go out of town and order that same drink, and the bartender at that particular pub or bar puts in 7.5 times as much alcohol, you might notice a difference, right? Something simple like that is maybe an example to think about how much product variability you might see in something like steel. And again, we want to treat it all the same from the financial perspective, but on the highly engineered specification level, when we get to the neat points of what a customer needs and expects in their product, it can start to matter more. And so again, that's why we want to encourage conversations between the suppliers and the producers so that they make sure that they get what they need and works well. Just briefly here, I mentioned A36 too as an individual specification. Actually, it's ASTM A36, and with that, they define chemistry and guaranteed property levels. So it's not a grade, it's not a designation, it's actually a spec. And sometimes it's important to make sure that people talk and confirm exactly what it is they're talking about. And again, it's been interesting to be in the industry as long as I have and to come across people who've had 10, 20, 30 years of experience and not understand what commercial steel means, really from a technical limit. It's good information to have and really help inform their decisions and their questions that they're going to ask, not only in their world to optimize what they want to do, but maybe to consider who their suppliers are and how they can better serve them. So with that, I wanted to share with you one little real-world example I think takes things to another level of understanding. A picture of a paper clip here. If you happen to have a paper clip near you, why don't you grab it for me? And if you don't have one, don't worry. I'll go through this little experiment and you'll see what I'm going to do. But if you have one with you, take this piece of steel, this little paper clip here you can see. It's a piece of steel that was delivered to me from my local office superstore, right, in another little box. Just pull it off their shelf, but it is a piece of steel. And what I want you to think about when you consider this paper clip is the fact that it has a certain amount of delivered characteristics, right? It's a piece of steel made into a trombone shape. It's going to form a shape and hopefully perform in the function that you want it to. But I want to take it a little bit deeper. I want you to think about the fact that you can't change the chemistry of what's been delivered to you. Right? Steel, once we solidify it into a solid and start to process it, chemistry's fixed, we can't change it. So it's the starting point of what defines about everything else about how we process it and ultimately what properties it takes to market. But if you consider it, you can't change the carbon content and you can't change how the atoms are arranged on a molecular level, but you can process this piece of steel. If you receive it into your facility and you want to make an intricately drawn shape, you might want to deform it and shape it and take it and bend it and have it survive all that processing to the point that you can make a part that your customer might care about and want to buy from you. But if I take this paper clip here and bend it into this shape and then grab either end of it and give it a twist, I'm deforming the steel. I'm going to work harden the steel. And again, we'll touch on this in the class, but what we're ultimately doing is forcing these atoms that are in this piece of steel to roll over themselves, to deform, and to ultimately increase their strength. That's what work hardening means. We're going to take, with each twist, it's a little bit harder to twist. It takes a little bit force from my arms to bend this piece of steel, but what I'm doing is seeing that it takes a little bit more strength each time I twist it and bend it. And ultimately what I'm going to do, and like many metals, really pretty much any material you might consider, the stronger and harder that it is, might be a good thing, but the less formability it's going to have. So as those two things balance each other out, as I work harden the steel and deform it, ultimately strengthen it, what I'm going to do is take the formability down. And you might know where this is ultimately going to go. If you wind a spring, or if you have a wind-up toy or even a watch, you might notice that towards the end of it, it gets a little bit harder to the point that you can't bend it anymore and you can't twist it anymore. But this paper clip, as I twist it, I'm going to eventually get it to the point where it fails and breaks. So I took the yield strength and the tensile strength all the way up to their absolute maximum. If I force it to go a little bit more, it breaks. Well, that wouldn't be good in a processing example. I don't want the piece of steel that I'm making to break in my press. And if I'm going to make a product like a tube like this, I want the flat piece of steel that was delivered to me that's going to go into my press and make a tube like this to survive the process, to not get to the point of breaking, but to the point that that piece of paper clip, that piece of steel that was delivered, was relatively soft and formable when I first got it. Now, if you happen to grab a piece or a paper clip in your office and you were doing this with me, maybe your paper clip performed a little bit like this one I happen to have. If I take this paper clip, do the same thing, grab either end of it and give it a twist, I only get half a twist in this one before it breaks. Now, it was harder to twist this one at the very beginning, but it didn't have much ductility or formability in it at all when I first did it. And it's interesting to me to use examples like something as simple as a paper clip and to understand that there's huge, from a deeper technical perspective, huge differences in terms of performance there. Now, for a paper clip, maybe it doesn't matter. It's still going to hold the papers together and do its job. But that particular piece of steel, if I'm going to make a drawn tube, or if I'm going to make a flat strength part, maybe I want the steel coming into my door to be very different. So think about that for a minute. If I'm going to make this drawn tube out of the steel that I was given from my supplier, do I want the first paperclip A steel, or do I want paperclip B steel? If you had to guess, probably paperclip A steel had a lot lower carbon content in it versus paperclip B. And so it's going to be softer and formable and more likely to make a part like this without failure. That would be great. So I want paperclip A steel if I'm making a part like this. But if I'm making a strength part, something that needs to be rigid and tough, like a transmission disc or a bridge component, a structural component that's going to hold things up, maybe I do want paperclip B steel to show up on my dock. That would be good for that application. It's not going to need to be heavily deformed. It just needs to make part in the shape that my customer needs. So hopefully that makes sense. But what I want you to think about then too is, what if you're making paper clips? What's important in that case? What's important to consider then in terms of product variability? Maybe not so much. Maybe as long as you can make that trombone shape. And in fact, I find it interesting that I got these paper clips that perform very differently, S for soft and H for hard, from the same manufacturer or from the same supplier to me. Very different in terms of performance. So maybe all they really care about is price. They just need steel. Maybe they bought it on the secondary market, but it worked well enough in their application. Maybe they needed to tweak their tooling a little bit to make the paperclip, but they still made a paperclip at the end of the day. So all they were concerned about was price in their application. But again, it all comes down to the end user, what their needs are, what their application expectations are, how that steel performs in their world, on how differentiated they want to get working with their suppliers. So it's going to be important for the drawn tube person maybe to pay a little bit more for a softer steel. They're going to pay an extra to get drawing steel versus commercial steel. And really, I haven't even touched on HSLAs and all the other different product forms that are out there. But hopefully that little snippet gives you a sense of the type of things we cover in the class, real world examples that anybody can relate to, hopefully, to get a better understanding of what steel is, how it's manufactured, how it's made, and how it ultimately gets put into market, and hopefully performs in a way that each person who gets it is able to use it to the best of their advantage. And it's important to consider as purchasing folks out there and supplier folks work out there, know their strengths and weaknesses. Every steel mill is a little bit different. Each steel mill has its strong points, its weak points. And it's going to be important for you to know if you're buying from an integrated mill, you might get this. If you're buying from an electric arc furnace mill, you might get this. But to work through those detailed levels to make sure that what you're getting ultimately works well for you, your company, and ultimately your customers. And coming to the Steel 101 class, I think will help you do that, to bridge those gaps, to connect those dots, to make new relationships, to meet folks in the industry. And I hope to see you soon at one of our in-person classes, given the chance. So hopefully that was helpful to you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much.